On the night of June 6, 1969, a North Vietnamese regiment came through the wire at a place called Firebase Crook. They had the numbers. They had the darkness. For a few minutes, they thought they had the Americans overrun. Then something roared in the clouds above them. A wall of red fire poured straight down out of the black sky. A solid, falling river of tracer, so dense it looked like the night itself was bleeding. The men on the ground had a name for the thing up there. The North Vietnamese did not. They only knew what it did to them. The Americans called it the Dragon, and by the time the sun came up over Tay Ninh province, the math of that night would make no sense at all. Two North Vietnamese regiments, more than 400 dead, and one American killed. Firebase Crook was not an accident. It was bait. In April of 1969, engineers from the 25th Infantry Division carved it out of the flat scrub 8.5 miles northwest of Tay Ninh City, close enough to the Cambodian border to smell it. They put it directly across one of the busiest infiltration routes in the war, the corridor the North Vietnamese used to move men and supplies between their sanctuaries in Cambodia and the killing ground of War Zone C. The Americans knew the enemy could not leave it alone. That was the entire idea. A small, isolated outpost dangled in front of an army daring it to attack. Inside the wire sat one reinforced rifle company, Bravo Company of the 3rd Battalion 22nd Infantry, and a single artillery battery. A few hundred men at most. The doctrine had a cold name. They called it the Offensive Fire Support Base. The base was the anvil. Everything that could shoot was the hammer. On the evening of June 5th, the hammer started to wake up. Seismic sensors buried in the tree lines began registering movement less than a kilometer to the northwest. Heavy movement. Major Joseph Hacia, the officer commanding the base, walked his artillery onto the trails and the likely assembly areas and brought every man to 100% alert. At 02:55 in the morning, the sky tore open. Rockets, recoilless rifle fire, mortars walking across the perimeter. Most of the heavy rockets screamed over the base and burst in the dark beyond it, but the mortars found the wire, and one of them found a man. One American was dead before the ground attack even began. Crook had been built to make the North Vietnamese army come and die. Now the question was whether the gamble would hold, or whether a few hundred men were about to be overrun in the dark. The thing they called for did not look like a weapon. It looked like a relic. The aircraft turning toward Crook in the blackness was a Douglas C-47, a Skytrain, a Goonie Bird, the same lumbering twin-engine transport that had hauled paratroopers over Normandy a quarter of a century earlier. By 1969, it was old, slow, and obsolete. But someone had cut 3 holes in its left side and fed a monster through them. The idea of firing sideways out of a banking aircraft had been pitched and shot down for nearly 40 years before Air Force Captain Ronald Terry finally made it work in 1964. The concept was almost insultingly simple. Bolt 3 electric Gatling guns into the side of a cargo plane. Fly it in a tight banking circle, a pylon turn, so the guns stay locked on a single point on the ground. Then hold the trigger down. Each of those 3 guns was a 7.62mm minigun. Each one could fire 6,000 rounds a minute, 100 bullets a second, pouring out of one spinning barrel cluster. Every 5th round was a tracer. That is the secret of the red waterfall. You are not seeing most of the bullets. You are seeing 1 in 5. The other 4 are invisible, and they are already in you. Holding its slow circle at 3,000 feet, the gunship could put a round into every single square yard of a piece of ground the size of a football field in seconds, and then it could do it again. And again, loitering for hours on 24,000 rounds and 45 flares. It had proven this long before Crook. On February 8, 1965, one of the first of these gunships circled a Viet Cong assault for more than 4 hours and fired 20,500 rounds into it until the attack simply stopped existing. At Khe Sanh in 1968, the same aircraft flew night after night over the besieged Marines, dropping flares and raking the hills, while the men below listened to it work and thanked God it was on their side. The Americans had a name for it by then. They called it Puff. Puff, the magic dragon. At Crook, on the night of June 6th, the dragon went to work. The 272nd Regiment came out of the south and the east, hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers moving fast across ground their commanders had studied in daylight, straight at Bravo Company's wire. This was a human wave assault. The plan was to eat the casualties, reach the bunker line, and bury the defenders under sheer mass before the firepower could catch up. For a few minutes, it almost worked. 16 North Vietnamese soldiers made it through the outer wire. They got inside the perimeter. Claymores and rifle fire cut them down where they stood, but the bunker line itself never broke. And then the firepower caught up. Battery A of the 7th Battalion, 11th Field Artillery dropped its tubes and fired directly into the charge, point blank. Time-fused shells bursting just over the heads of the attackers, throwing steel down into them. In that one assault, the guns alone killed 76 men. Then the flares ignited overhead, and the whole battlefield turned a sick, swinging white. Into that light came the sound. Not a rattle of gunfire, a deep, grinding howl, less like a weapon than like a chainsaw the size of a building, tearing the sky apart. The men who heard it never forgot it. The tracer fell. It did not look like separate shots. It looked like a solid rope of red light bolted from the aircraft to the earth, dragging slowly across the open paddies where the enemy had nowhere to hide. Out to the west, the fields of fire ran clean for 1,000 meters. Flat, bare ground. The worst possible place on earth to be caught under a gunship. The 272nd broke and pulled back into the dark. This is the part worth understanding, because it is the entire reason the gunship existed. A jet could carry far more explosive than Puff ever could. But a jet came past at hundreds of miles an hour and got one pass, in the dark, at a target it could barely see. Puff did not make passes. Puff stayed. It circled the same patch of ground for hours, lit it so the enemy couldn't hide in the night, and saturated it so completely there was no gap to run through. It didn't outshoot the enemy, it outstayed him. Crook had been built to make the North Vietnamese attack. Now it was proving exactly why that was a death sentence. They came back anyway. The next night, June 7th, they sent more. At 0200, a Nighthawk helicopter caught movement in the dark and called artillery down on it. At 0300, the rockets and shells fell on Crook again. And at 0430, 2 full battalions of the 88th Regiment hit the northern side of the base. This was the bigger attack, and it went looking for a seam. On the northeast corner, where the first wave had come in light, the North Vietnamese pushed hard, hunting for the weak point in the line. Specialist 4 Richard Marroquin, a machine gunner with Bravo Company, was sitting on that corner. He saw the wave turning toward the gap, swung his M60 onto it, and held the trigger down. The enemy answered with a storm of rocket-propelled grenades. The bunkers Bravo had built took the blasts and held. Marroquin did not stop firing. And above all of it, the Dragon came back around. The same howl, the same falling red light, artillery, Cobra gunships, and Puff overhead, all of it pouring into the same shrinking pocket of men caught in the open, while the infantry held the wire and refused to give an inch. When the firing finally died, and the sun came up on June 7th, the ground around Firebase Crook was carpeted with the dead. 323 North Vietnamese soldiers were killed that night. Not one American died. Over the 2 nights, the count passed 400. 2 North Vietnamese regiments had thrown themselves at a single reinforced company and a handful of guns, and been destroyed. The Americans had lost the 1 man killed by that mortar round on the first night, and 8 wounded. That was the whole price. 1 dead. 400 enemy in the wire and the wood lines. The bait had worked exactly as designed. Captain Larry Thomas, who had run Bravo Company's bunker line on foot through both nights, moving to wherever the threat was worst, said it plainly afterward. "They were all heroes," he said. "The men knew what to do before I had a chance to direct them." The North Vietnamese never wrote down a name for the gunship, but they recorded what they did about it. They left. After the slaughter at Crook, the 272nd Regiment broke off and avoided serious contact with American forces for months. And it was the same all across the war. Men who would charge machine guns and artillery without breaking would go to ground and refuse to move the instant they heard those engines and saw the first tracer fall. The fear was rational. There was no cover from a weapon that came straight down out of the sky and never had to stop. But the Dragon was not invincible, and the men who flew it knew that better than anyone. It was, after all, a 25-year-old transport plane. To put its fire on a target, it had to fly low and slow in a predictable circle, which made it a predictable target. As North Vietnamese anti-aircraft fire grew heavier through the war, that slow orbit grew deadlier to fly. Around a dozen of these gunships were shot down in combat. Every man aboard understood that the same low, patient pass that saved the grunts on the ground was the thing most likely to get him killed. They flew it anyway. Firebase Crook was one of the Dragon's last great nights. By the end of 1969, The old C-47s were worn out and being handed off to the South Vietnamese. The last American Puff flew its final combat mission that December. The idea, it proved, never died. It grew teeth and became the AC-130 gunship still flying today. But the original Dragon, the Goonie bird with 3 guns punched through its side, went quietly out of the war it had helped to define. Captain Gray, one of the officers at Crook, put the whole thing into a single sentence. It was a costly mistake for the North Vietnamese, he said, after their disaster at Crook. 400 men learned that in 2 nights, on open ground, under a falling river of red light. They never knew its name. They only knew that something in the clouds above them had woken up, and that there was no cover anywhere on Earth from the breath of the Dragon.